I'm Sam Lazar. I'm the Curator of Academic Programming at the Hopkins Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to today's talk. I want to thank right away the Hood Museum, Alisa Swindell, of course, and our colleagues there who are collaborating with the HOP on this event, as well as the MLK committee and the campus-wide MLK celebrations and everyone who was involved in pulling all of that together. We're so happy to collaborate with all of you on this event. So Jason Moran here has been in residence on campus all week. Hopefully some of you caught his solo performance on Wednesday night or his performance with his band last night in Spalding Auditorium. He's been visiting classes and having other conversations and visiting the observatory and doing all sorts of interesting things. And we're really excited to wrap up his residency with this discussion today on this both timely and eternal topic, art, music, culture, and the urgency of now. Thank you both for being here today.
Tell us a little bit about kind of how you got your start, where you came to jazz.
I mean, there's a lot of ways to approach that. There's many ways to approach that question as snowflakes outside right now. But I might say, if I try to keep it local, I think about, it's just the house I grew up in. And I grew up in Houston, Texas, and my parents, when they would take my brothers and I to school, my mother was either listening to Glenn Gould's Goldberg Variations or the jazz station. And I hated both of them. It's like, I'll turn both of that off. Like, it's hip hop, it's the 80s. It's like can we listen to my brother's favorite radio stations? And the one thing about exposure is over time, like photography, like it starts to leave an image. And for the music, it left a sound. And though I was playing piano as a Suzuki student as a kid, by the time I got 13, some of that sound started to make sense that I was hearing on the radio. Some of the sounds of the records that my parents had in their record collection started to make sense. It was almost like it really was eureka moment. And the gateway was Thelonious Monk, the pianist and composer, and he was playing this solo piece around midnight, and it just struck. And it wasn't that the song was so beautiful. It was actually, it just didn't sound anything like the Suzuki music I was playing. And I ran to the piano trying to find the sound that I heard on the record, and I couldn't find the notes. But I'm looking at the piano and all the notes are there, but I couldn't find the combination to play that melody. And I'd say from that point on, that's just been my search, is to try to find the combination on the keys.
Chasing after Monk is not a bad thing to do. So as you moved into an understanding and you were growing and maturing and finding these sounds that were different, that you now also came to view in different places, what else did you learn that was about more than what regular teachers were telling you to find in the notes?
That's a good question, because it starts with, sometimes we think as musicians that it's just the music. But as a kid, you're thinking like, well, what are they wearing? And then as an older musician that now travels the world, it's like, where are they? Beyond what city? What's the club look like? And in this image here, we see this incredible band with Charlie Parker and Miles Davis in a club on 52nd Street in the 40s called the Three Deuces. And I started to just look at the architecture. What's the space? And that's here our ceiling is this, right? But that ceiling is just higher than the bass player. So that means the ceiling is about like this, Okay, so now the music not only has a place that it's encased in a corner in a basement, coming from grand ballrooms of Harlem, now to these basements of Midtown. And most importantly, if you go to the next slide, is I think in this next image we see the great drummer Max Roach, who also is a kind of an activist and revolutionary. But Max Roach is playing the revolutionary instrument, the drums, and what that represents for us as a culture. And he's shoved in a corner in a padded wall. And that's It's a very rare feeling, but it's also a very rare image. And he's got a great smile in the space too.
That's right, because it almost like suggests that was the padded room.
That's right.
But we did talk earlier about how the architecture itself also changes the sound.
Yes, it does.
Being at Brad Baller Beats with high ceilings and everything allows the sound to float when you're in these low ceilinged rooms, these tight rooms that are smoky and full of people that love, that are here for the love of music. What that changes as well.
Yeah, acoustically, it's like in a small space like that, it's like it allows every line to be sonically, for lack of a better term, audible or visible. You can hear every line. And so the music of bebop in the 40s was about really etching that line very cleanly and finely. And the band was very nimble. So it just allowed for like a kind of specificity of the phrase. In a small unit, I've been relating it to like a small flock of birds, like they really do fly really quickly. And they're able to cut like that. But when I think about also Max Roach, I think that though he's in this space, that he's also thinking about what the drums have represented and, Black people in America, how the drums are always an important part of our evolution and our communication method. And so to have the drums be taken away for centuries, to hear this drummer is in the corner, that he also is thinking about the revolution that will be happening in about 10 or 15 years from now. So maybe the next image shows him, making this call. And he's using the music to make the call. And the places he learns from, the Charlie Parkers and Miles Davises and Charles Mingus's that he plays with, they all are making the music because the art is important for them, but it's also it's a coping mechanism for the outside world. It's also a salve. The blues is a salve for the things that they experience off of the bandstand. And so to just relegate the music as a music student just to the music is a real fault of the kind of education I mostly was given. And that thankfully I grew up in a household with a lot of pride and a lot of Black pride to understand that there were always going to be layers that should be researched and felt and read about, and it may not all exist on the record.
Yeah, and and at that time, the time they're making this music, but on the West Coast, we talked about that LA, many communities were starting to come together around jazz. There were record stores and clubs that had a very interracial mix. And that's why the police started cracking down, so much of what the divide became and how LA is even still set up now was try to break jazz. The police chief was determined that was not going to happen. And so, where people could go, where they can move without getting stopped became a thing. And so, when you see them in these moments to carry a musical instrument as a Black man in that city at that time was to be stopped. And so the revolution, but to not hide you were a musician, you still wanted to get to the gig. So it was always that, that rumbling. The pushback was happening, but that's because they weren't pushing forward. And I love that your household was a place that could let that be part of it. And so,
yeah, this image, this is of the drummer who was playing last night in my band. This is Nasheed Waits, and Nasheed Waits is the godson of Max Roach. And so this is Nasheed Waits sitting in my version of the Three Deuces that was shown in the Venice Biennial. Maybe we go to the next slide, we'll see, that's it in color, and then the next slide is what the band looks like in the space. It's now in the collection of the Virginia Museum of Art, but it is it's something about kind of what is recorded, meaning like on a record, the live records that were made at the Three Deuces, we have the sound. But I really was obsessed with that first image of Max Roach in that corner. I was like, what is this venue? And as a person who travels, I think, like the venue that I perform in is just as important as the music I make. We have to be in a kind of dialogue with one another. And you're really also it's determining how it meets the people. And so this was my attempt to really try to document something else rather than, I could transcribe the songs and I could play Thelonious Monk solo from this club, but what was it about the space? And whether or not this is a replication, whatever, but it was just to replace ourselves as contemporary musicians in the kind of architecture that was from the 1940s.
And what was it to do that other than as being out?
It was perfect. I mean, bless the spirit of Okwe and Wazor, who really made it, I think, a groundbreaking biennial. That his invitation was to say, well, what would you propose? And I said, I've been thinking about this, and before I could finish, he was like, do it. And I was like, okay, but what money? Will I make these kind of, or have these stages fabricated, and then put in crates, and then sent to Venice, and then have, like how this all happened. So I learned a lot in that moment, but I really learned, and I think it's the thing that comes up in the conversation throughout the week, especially with improvisation, is the trust that one has to have with the other. And in that moment, a person like Okwe and Wazor or Thelma Golden, who really also pushed his arm and said, you should talk to Jason, that those two people were like, no, let's improvise together and have this moment come up. And so that I could start to ask these questions that may have been sitting dormant otherwise.
So visual art is, part of the reason Thelma Golden would push his art is because you have this deep relationship with the visual arts as well. It is part of your praxis, and tell me how it was so deeply ingrained in what your mentors brought to you, shared with you. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship between musicians and the visual element?
I mean, that also goes back to my house. I was raised in with my parents, and my parents collected art, and they collected also local artists. And this is an image of Ellis Marsalis, the father of all the Marsalises. And Ellis Marsalis was one of my teachers when I was still in high school. And so he came by the house to give me a lesson. And behind me is a drawing by the great artist John Biggers, a piece called Two Wings. And so I think my parents didn't really care much like they didn't care what my brothers and I thought about the music, they didn't want us to care about the art they collected either. They're like, this is our house. Underneath the piano was, pottery, so the home was kind of a place for reaction and reflection. And then I feel my parents really saw themselves in the work that they collected. And they felt that the community also, this was ours, this is our community. And we collect our community just like we collect the records. And it felt like very, very normal to grow up with a drawing like that behind me, or the next slide, which is a painting called Shotguns by John Biggers, which is a monumental piece about the gathering of people, the shotgun houses that are across my neighborhood in Houston and much of the South, 3rd Ward. It was like, no, the house matters. The house is the museum too. It's not just the museum, it's the house is the museum. And the people inside, the stories and the food and the drinks and the conversation, that's the work. And I don't know, my parents did it and their siblings and my large family used to really etch that into me. So when I moved to New York, I didn't feel like I was alone. I felt like they gave me enough vitamins to chew on, even though I was far away from Houston. And that some of those things throughout my career, I would try to make sure that I touched on, because I felt like I didn't want to leave that part behind. Even though it may not come up as a subject, art may not necessarily come up as a subject. I'm in high school music. I knew that I needed to go see what was happening in the galleries. I knew I needed to go to the museums to look at an exhibition. And that would be a part of how I would enrich, hopefully, the music that I would make that night.
So you had also mentioned to me that you had some teachers or one particular teacher who drew his own colors to his sheet music.
Right, that's true. Yeah, my teacher Jackie Bayard, who was from Worcester, but maybe most famously was in Charles Mingus's band, this revolutionary ensemble. But when I'd have my lessons with him every Monday, he would bring 2 massive volumes of music, and each one was music he had handwritten, he had transcribed, and he had written it out fully. And the cover of each sheet of music had its own graphic drawing, and I mean like a real drawing. And so there are hundreds of drawings, that he has in his collection or had in his collection. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Because sheet music, say in the early 20th century, all of those pieces that were sold and manufactured all had these very ornate covers. So he's like hearkening to a time that used to exist, but he was making his own covers. And I would say Jackie Bayard was also like a catalyst, because there was an exhibition at the Whitney Museum called Blues for Smoke. It was kind of how contemporary art responds to the blues. And the curator, Bennett Simpson, I said, yo, you go to some Jackie Bayard record. And he was like, well, I'm a big Jackie Bayard fan. That's why he named the show this. And I said, well, Blues for Smoke, okay, great with that nod to Jackie Bayard, but wouldn't it be great if we had Jackie Bayard's drawings in the exhibition too? And so I gave them some drawings with them to exhibit in the exhibition, because these are the kinds of examples of teachers that I had that were always kind of making those connections, whether they would be public or not. And I felt like the creativity that one could have could also be private and be as robust as the music one could make publicly. But I wanted to start to showcase that my teachers really did have this multidisciplinary mindset as well. It's just that maybe everybody didn't know about it.
And that multidisciplinary urge has also led you to collaborate with some amazing people, share space with them, including Julie Moran too. So this is actually a copy of the piece by Julie Moran that we have at the Hoods collection. Please come by and see it when it's up next, which is Iridium over at Aleppo. And but you were friends with her, and you have worked together and shared space. And I read about how you stored some of your stuff in a space that she was working in, but then you actually got to go in and still use the equipment. So you're making music while she's working on her paintings. So the two of you working here. Tell me about that.
I was telling maybe with the class yesterday about how I used to read about the image I have of the Harlem Renaissance. And so when you read it in a book, it's like everything is kind of flattened into 400 pages with beautiful images and nice stories. But what was it really like on the day-to-day basis? How does Zora Neale Hurston look walking out of the bakery? And then she's stopped by someone else, and then they have a conversation. Like, does she have a conversation with Langston Hughes? What is that conversation? Not the one that's like in front of people, but the private one. And I live uptown. Julie lives uptown in Harlem as well. But I had a studio space for some years, at the MacArthur years, where I could afford a studio space. And once that money ran out, I was like, I got to get out of here. But I didn't have anywhere to store these instruments that I had. And so Julie was like, oh, I have a space. Why don't you bring it by? Bring it to this massive church that she was making these two paintings that she was commissioned to make for San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And so I walked in and I dropped my instruments off, and I was like, okay, Julie, you didn't say it was like this. But for me, like for me what I felt the Renaissance was like. It was like people kind of like helping one another out.
That sharing and the depth.
And then something grows out of that. And so it felt more functional than it did, kind of like let's finish this idea. And
small intimacies that lead to great things.
Yeah, and also like she's trying something, at a scale. I mean, Julie also always works at a large scale. She's got very big ideas all the time, and she somehow gets to cover like this entire wall. And so here she was working in this church, decommissioned church on 118th Street. And maybe in the next slide, you think, well, that's scales. And then I think on the next slide, we'll hear her talk about these paintings she was making, which I think is good to hear.
I went several times to San Francisco to visit the museum. I was there staring at this very cavernous open space with these two walls, and I started to think about the national parks and the representations of American landscape painting. And specifically, when I came back, I kept thinking about the Hudson River Valley school painters, like Edward Church, Thomas Cole, Bierstadt, because they really encapsulate that idea of going westward. I started to layer the blurred color images into these historic landscape paintings. Just prior to emancipation, Native Americans of the Sierras and the Western frontiers, We're completely annihilated by this expansionist project. What was interesting was that aspect of both annihilation and then preservation shortly after can exist on the same geographic landscape. San Francisco then, as a site, became important because that was this destiny of going out west.
How you doing?
Jason Moran wrote me after seeing some paintings, and he talked about them as a score.
Just trying to start.
And I was super interested in that.
How's it going? Nice to see you.
And so we started working together here in a very, very loose and open way. It's kind of an amazing thing to paint in a church. Everything kind of reverberates back into here, energy-wise, consciousness-wise, and everything that has taken place this year in my personal life, with my children, with what has happened politically. All of that is immersed in these paintings.
So like the part where she says, everything reverberates back, like the acoustics of the space that a painting is made, versus and the acoustic of a space where music is made, is that the space part really does matter. And it shows up and prints itself somehow. And mostly it's legible maybe to the ones who make it, but I think part of that still exists for those who witness the work as well. And so it was just a kind of like a really like a transformative moment to spend that time with her as she's really finishing these two incredible paintings, and to be a witness to it.
And takes us back to that idea of architecture coming to shape the music, shape the ideas.
I mean, and also, like we're in a church.
Yeah.
We're in a Harlem church, right? So, like, and what that kind of, let's say, for lack of a better term, like aspiration that people who gathered in there are looking for, and where does this show up? Where's the evidence of that throughout the day or the week that you're going to be reminded of on Sunday? So then you can start Monday. Okay.
And also, what kind of music would have lived there? Because it definitely would have been a space where music was just an integral part of everything they did. We're not going to have a Harlem church and there's not music just soaked into the walls.
That piano that was a few slides earlier, that's the piano that was in there, which hadn't been tuned in a very long time. And then we got tuned. And so like Julie kept those instruments, that's not my piano. That was the piano that was in the space. And so, like those are just kind of moments where, you couldn't script that any better.
And she's not the only artist that you've worked with. You've also collaborated with Adrian Piper and Glenn Ligon, Nicole Simpson, the Curator that I am. I, of course, want to hear more about that. Talk to me about these amazing people and working with them, doing what you do.
There's so many ways to think about artists like Glenn Ligon as a painter, but also what he represents, like maybe his North Star, you could say, is James Baldwin. He has a new group of drawings that are up in New York City right now, still based on Baldwin. For Glenn Ligon, Baldwin is like my Thelonious Spunk. I will always come back to Thelonious Spunk, and Glenn frequently returns to the texts of James Baldwin, but finds a way to always have a new way to absorb them. And Lorna Simpson was working on kind of remaking old photographs in this moment where, in this video she was making, where she dresses as a man and that she also dresses as a woman. She plays chess against herself. And then over time, through the 18-minute video, the competitors, they get older and older as they perform. And then so Lorna's query to me was, so what's the sound for this? And she didn't say anything else. So I showed up and kind of improvised based on these incredible Schumann piano exercises. This one about opposition that has the hands moving in opposition. But it's so glorious, one as an exercise, but also as a melody. And then over time, I start to improvise on this exercise, and that becomes the length of the video. And I had 3 passes, and of course the third pass was the best pass. And so it's just in these conversations that no one really knows what their work will be in the end. It's that they just want to see what's possible. And the stuff oftentimes spills over the table, and that's the stuff that we gather. Whenever it's not on the table, that's what we want for the work. Even for Glenn Ligon, he wanted to remake the final scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Uncle Tom is laying on his deathbed. And so he made a video of himself dressed as Uncle Tom, laying on this bed and dying, right? That's what the video was. But when they went to develop the film footage, none of it turned out. It all was like very blurry, and you couldn't see any of it. Yeah, and that's what he used. All the blurred footage, because it felt much like his painting practice, how he treats James Baldwin. And he couldn't have planned that, right? That was just an error. Or you say the universe, you know? The universe saying, actually, maybe it's more over here. And then, yeah.
You know, so many of his like best known works were that layering of text and layering and layering till it becomes illegible. But if it's in, you get a word here, you get a word there, if that's what that building is, what ends up being the message. And just through a technical error or the universe, the fact that you got that same thing out of a video about such a crucial text is, like, again, those small miracles that happen in the midst of creation.
Yeah, and I also think about Art Blakey, the great drummer and band leader. Art Blakey used to say a thing to his band, which he called the Jazz Messengers. He says, when you make a mistake, make it loud. Or he'd say, play it again. Play the mistake again. That started to turn, some people are misusing that right now. I got to say, shut up now.
As we speak of him now, yes.
So,
Do not repeat that error, yes.
Anyway, but I think about that for us who are creating, like, stuff slips and it falls, and how we respond to that. That actually becomes the work, and sometimes that's legible. But for us who are making, we feel it every time, and it is an opportunity rather than like a moment of depression. It's an opportunity.
Yeah, when you talked about working with Lorna Simpson on the chess piece, it made me think one of my coworkers had the privilege of getting to see your performance on Wednesday, and she talked about, she was thinking, one hand was keeping the melody, keeping everything steady, and that the other hand was off doing its own thing, and she thought about like how your brain works, that you're able to tell one hand to do one and one to do the other. But similarly, when you think about a chess match, and you are always supposed to be thinking about what the other person might be about to do to make it successful. So your brain has to have your own game going and their game going. And it sounds like that's kind of what you brought into this imagery of competitors over a chessboard, is your hands sort of having that same match and your brain having to do both games.
Yeah, the opposition part is very real. And even though, it might exist on a chess, board in front of us, but it really does also bleed out everywhere else too. And because she didn't lay out much framework, it just allowed for the piece to feel also like an improvisation. And now that work kind of gets shown kind of around the world, it became a timely thing, or it became also just for me something to learn about the process that I felt differently when I worked with, musician to musician. I learned something else working with them, but I think sometimes like maybe not necessarily leaving that world, but having another framework for the music. That was something that I've begun to learn over the past 20 years is the collaborations with these artists like Adrian Piper and Joan Jonas, especially those two women show up when my mother dies. Like they show up as central figures for the past 20 years of my life. As like, Jason, the intention matters to you too. And we're going to help you realize that.
And clearly those artists have rubbed off on you in many ways, because you also make prints, you make joints in visual art. It's a video. Run through a few of yours here.
Yeah, the piano is called a manual, the keyboard is called a manual. So I make my drawings or frottages or rubbings at the piano. And it's really also related to the artist Joan Jonas, who frequently during our performances together, she makes a drawing. It's almost a recording of the moment of the performance, mid-performance. And so these works on paper are approaches to the piano, asking also the question, like, what is recorded, at the piano? Is it just the sound? But that instrument that's over there, or the instrument down in Spalding, is still holding residue from my hand and all the previous pianist's hands. And so that oil, or that attack, or that sensation that the instrument feels is energy. And so a lot of these drawings, these were from the exhibition that just closed at Mass Polka 2 weeks ago. But the drawings, each one of them, I feel like has a way of recording a different part or a different sound. And the paper, because paper is this paper from Japan is so sensitive that it's just dry pigment. It's not mixed or anything. It's really just the pigment's relationship to the keyboard underneath and my hand. And what we see here, that's it before I now have another studio space. But this is in my in-laws' backyard in Stamford, Connecticut. And that's where I used to make the drawings because it's so toxic as dust. But anyway, the part, I think one other part about being up here is being reminded of the situation that work is made in. And working outside meant that I had to wait until the wind would die down so that the pigment wouldn't just totally fly everywhere. And how could I work with the atmosphere to leave something on the page? And so these continue to be a series of drawings that I'm not tiring of, much like I don't tire my relationship with the piano, because they get to show me something else that I may not be able to see or hear.
As we close, I'm just going to go through a few pieces that we talked about that are up in the exhibition now. Biddy Andrews' Witness, in this beautiful Charles White, in this piece about Birmingham by Dawu Bang. As we talk about those and think about those, we talked a lot about how art, music, visual arts, writers, all of it, in all its forms, that art is something that helps us to survive. It's something that supports us. It's something that helps us imagine a future. And so, as part of the theme to this was the urgency of now. What is that urgency that you're working with your practice right now?
I mean, it should be evident that what I believe is true about the work that I make or have believed in is worth coming back around and say it again. And just to think that maybe I talked about it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what time has changed. And if I really think that much about Thelonious Monk, then maybe I should say his name again. Or Barry Lou Williams, or all of these people who have made such an impact on the piano and then on future music history. But I guess I also want to ask you the question also, because in your exhibition, there's a certain frequency, that the works have with one another. And maybe just ask you as a curator, how did you choose to inhabit a room with the works that are in the Hood's collection of this show?
One, it was co-curated, and so there were a lot of conversations between Amelia and I about what stories we wanted to tell, what did the collection have to offer, because it is, it's built out of what we had existing. So sometimes there are stories you want to tell more about, but the work isn't there, or there are pieces that you're like, this has to, no matter what else we do, this has to be in the show. And then we're teaching museum. And so how is this going to be part of, teaching our multiple constituencies, but starting with Dartmouth students, and then going out in the ripples that, our museum does. And knowing that it was, it's always a difficult, the show is around slavery and its afterlives, and that's always a difficult conversation. And it's an extra tricky conversation at this moment. And so how do you tell hard truths? And how do you let the artist who thought about this and produced work around these topics, how do you let their work speak? And be a conversation. That's really what a curator largely is doing, is we're not just choosing what we like, we're figuring out how do these things talk to each other in a way that lets other people hear their stories louder.
Yeah, and that way it feels like the conductor, you know. And now, and up, you know, so like,
A little louder,
a little louder, more light, you know. What I mean? So like that's what I enjoyed about the exhibition and walking through it with you was looking at these works, have a conversation across the room, you know, where does one kind of live in the shadow to tell this kind of shadow story that, you know, but loudly still. The Hell Woodward piece is something about particularly, and so that's something I always crave, because I think in museum spaces, and I like you said, it's a teaching museum, because in their best case, they're actually like leaving an imprint on you, the viewer, you know, that when you walk back out into the world and you think about it, Dawood's pieces are incredible, the story that he lays out, or the science, or let's say the time he wants to capture on film. With these two portraits, they hit, and when we walk back into the world, I think the great pieces somehow leave a sensation for us to try to grapple with, you know, not just, you know.
It's a type of imprint that you're capturing with those pigments. What has been here, layers and layers, and never went before, and those keys, yeah. Okay, so I'm sure people have things that they would love to ask you and talk to you about. So now we're going to enter the Q&A session. But actually look out like I know there are people in the room again. So again, thank you for letting us chat before you. And so we don't have a runner, so I'm just going to sort of point, probably call out your shirt color if you raise your hand. So does anyone have anything that they would like to ask Jason while we still have him on campus for a little bit longer? I know people that come to these things are more inquisitive than that. Come on, don't be shy. We're very nice.
Just gonna say, I was able to go see your work at multi stuff, and he was Ukraine boy, but did tell a story. You were mentioning about the case day about what the musician means with these on the piano, but also maybe I'd love to hear a little bit more about how those pieces of work are like their own. They have their own energy. They have their own mood, which is the highest. So before even reading him or knowing you are here being some, just like maybe a little bit more about that story.
Sure. I might say that you talk about the two stages. I think sometimes when I'm making works that are maybe four of them now, one, the Savoy Ballroom in the 1920s, one we saw, which the Three Deuces, which is in the 1940s, and a place called Slugs from the 1960s, and a place called Studio Rifby from the 1970s. So these are all four venues in New York City. But part of kind of remaking the space is also that the stage, when there's no musician on it, is waiting. The instruments are waiting. And so there is an energy of anticipation of the absent musician, or the band that's going to arrive. They're not there yet. And so for each of them, let's say for the Savoy Ballroom, rather than just have it be this Savoy Ballroom is incredible. It's incredible art wall in the back that aren't up over the band. All these incredible big bands that were playing there for thousands of dancers. And rather than just have the music from that era, I thought it should be the ring shouts and the field hollers that really inform those big bands. And so what we hear are the field hollers, or the hammer into the ground, that I think is the bedrock of the music, and that it is the sound from that space. And so each of those spaces, those venues are in waiting for the musicians to show up. But in time, they have their own kind of resonance too. And one thing I like for each of them is to try to find a detail and kind of make mistakes with the details, just to kind of warp them just a little bit to make them feel a little bit off as well.
There are just some amazing photographs of the Savoy Ballroom and the dancers there, but those photographs, the best ones, Curator, there's something a little twisted and a little off in them too. That's something about that space seems to have given off this energy that was just a little manic and a little dangerous.
Yeah, rightfully so. I mean, where's the place where you can let loose? You know, besides the house party, you know, that you have to help pay your rent. Where are the places where we can let loose, you know, and be out loud, you know, and these venues, or, you know, the spaces that we don't know about, there are more, but this is what we know about. And so I felt like a real, you know, like in service to the music and its history to try something like this. Right now, where the Savoy Ballroom stands on 140th Street, Lenox Avenue, it's now a 5 and dime store. You know, that's fine. There's something there. There's a little plaque, you know, right next to it that said Savoy Ballroom stood here. But you know, these spaces mean something. And yes, they mostly disappear, and they disappear without any ceremony. There was a club called the Lenox Lounge, 124th Street, Lenox Avenue, in the heart of Harlem. And I thought this place would be here forever. It was, you know, and when they shuttered it, I thought, okay, well, maybe it'll reopen. And then when they bulldozed it, I thought, well, no opportunity. So I went to the site, the construction site, and I asked, I said, you've got to give me some bricks from this building. And so I have these bricks that I saved from our collection of the buildings that are being destroyed. Cultural legacies are kind of being rooted out of this country. And it's not just Harlem, you know, it's everywhere.
Gene?
So I appreciate your discussion of urgency, but also of like the history of, you know, your studies and connecting deeper and finding those, you know, kind of everyday, unspoken, not public moments. I think for a lot of people, this moment we're in does feel urgent, but for a lot of people, the urgency has always been there. And there's like a level of exhaustion I'm seeing, even like here among our students. And when I'm teaching, you know, that exhaustion, what are these moments of talk you've found in places that you might not realize, or like those mistakes that you've made that have been opportunities? Because I think that's always what I'm trying to like convey to students when we have people like you here is like, you didn't get here through a straight and direct path that didn't have, you know, lots of ups and downs and failure. And, you know, we don't talk about those things publicly. So this, any way you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll say the first part that I realized, I think for a lot of us, is routine is worrisome, and beware of it. So as an improviser, we try to make sure that we don't follow the routine enough so that we kind of keep some fresh air coming into the song. The other night when I was invited to the observatory, I didn't really check what temperature it was. So I just walked out. I was dressed warm everywhere except the socks I wore. And the weather told me, the temperature told me, your feet are cold, your toes are like feeling it. But I was like, nah, but in service to the planets, I'm gonna bear the brunt of this pain and stand here to learn something. And I felt like that is the moment that I feel that a lot of us are in. What are the places that we think we always go to get the source of inspiration, but there are other ones. And sometimes the invitation could be a passing. And, you know, for me, believe me, that night, if I just will really be honest, I really was 50-50. I looked at the email like, I can't really go out there tonight and look at this. Like I had to be really honest. Like, and then I said, yes, you are. Because we're gonna look at the news. Don't do that. Right? And just enough time of just like playing with the question of like, do you or don't you? Did I then walked across campus over there in the dark, you know, and waited for the professor to show up and then for him to show me a vast world in a matter of 60 minutes. And that, for me, transformative. And that's a very small, like, introductory level thing. And so I invite the people that I come into contact with there's to do the same thing with music, to listen to music you don't like, to go see a band live you don't know nothing about, you did a read a review of, but just kind of try to go hear things. And in a place like this, it invites a lot in. So we do have opportunities to kind of just go sit with ideas. But it's a rare moment to feel like I'm on a campus where I could go look at the planets. I could play a solo show for Ellington. I could talk about Jupiter and the sound that John Coltrane thinks Jupiter is, right? With students, then I could play a second concert with my band, and that I could still be chewing on the ideas from the cold. And that's, for me, is the source. And I try to exhibit it to not only to audience, whatever, but especially to my friends who make music and make all kinds of practices. It's like, how do we make sure that we weasel ourselves out of these situations that are really aimed to trap us? And as artists, we really are out here off grid anyway. It sometimes seems like, you've got it all figured out. But the best part about trusting like the piano for me is that I don't at all. And each time I get to that instrument, it presents a series of challenges and questions. And whether my body is able to produce the things that I think are the answers is still up to me to a degree. But it needs input, and it can't revolve on the same input to get a new answer. What I say, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so so there's something in making sure we bring something else to the table that maybe we don't expect sometimes. And I'm positive it shows up every day, but maybe we have to raise our antenna enough as friends to one another to still try to engage with it, to see a show, ask questions about, wow, like what did that would really mean with those two photographs? What is that double portrait about? And when you learn what it's about, it's like, ooh, but I'll leave that discovery for you all.
Well, on that wonderful note of, inspiration to go discover, thank you all for being here and listening to this conversation and sharing your morning with us. And please go discover. Don't fear the cold.